Welcome to Dialogue.
Today, we are diving into it's a really volatile, high-stakes intersection.
It absolutely is. We're looking at that exact moment when scientific discovery, something we think of as objective, as methodical, leaves the protected space of the lab.
And just collides head-on with political power.
Exact.
Science, at its very core, it's a process. It's designed to seek objective truth. But politics, by its nature, is driven by something completely different.
By ideology, by advantage, by holding on to authority.
And when those two forces meet, the rules of the game they change completely. We're looking at what happens when data suddenly becomes ammunition.
When findings are filtered through political self-interest.
And when experts who thought they were just doing research suddenly find themselves thrust into the role of partisan spokespersons.
That collision point, that's exactly where our mission for this deep dive begins. It's where the objective findings from a research journal or a government lab enter a public arena that's already defined by these deep ideological battle lines.
We're trying to understand the political life of science.
Right. How facts get interpreted, how they get reframed, cherry-picked.
Or sometimes just buried, completely buried.
And the key is, the science itself might not have changed at all. But the political stakes, they definitely did.
And this dynamic is just essential for anyone trying to navigate the modern information landscape. I mean, if you're making long-term decisions, whether they're financial or policy-related or even just deciding who to trust.
You have to understand the mechanics, you have to see how these scientific narratives are built and sometimes manipulated.
Our goal here is to really dissect those tactics to show how this distortion influences everything from massive federal policy all the way down to the current, very real global crisis of public trust.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's unpack this fundamental conflict. When we talk about scientific research, we have this image of a very methodical, rigorous process. It's all about understanding the natural world.
It's supposed to be. But the moment that understanding, that new piece of knowledge, threatened a multi-billion-dollar industry or maybe a core national security belief.
Or even just a deeply held political ideology.
It instantly stops being about pure discovery.
And it starts being about persuasion, about control.
That is the critical transformation. The second those findings move from the peer-reviewed sphere to, say, the halls of government, truth, truth immediately becomes secondary to building a narrative.
So scientific uncertainty, which is actually a healthy part of research, right? It's just acknowledging what we don't yet know.
Right. It's essential. It's how science moves forward. But in the political arena, that same uncertainty becomes a vulnerability. It's seen as a weakness, and it's ripe for exploitation.
It's no longer a call for more rigorous study.
No, it becomes an ideological battlefield. It's the perfect excuse to stall action.
And we see that this co-opting of science, it isn't random, it's highly targeted. The analysis shows there are, 4 primary political objectives for why scientific findings get distorted or weaponized?
Yes, 4 objectives that really define the whole motivation structure. And the first, and maybe the most straightforward, is using science to justify decisions.
Decisions that have probably already been made for other reasons.
Almost certainly. If a government wants to implement a policy that's, say, economically costly or unpopular with a key part of their base, or maybe it just shifts resources in a dramatic way.
Like a major change in immigration policy or a new tax on carbon emissions.
Exactly. Citing the data or saying the science demands it gives them this immediate, powerful cover. It looks neutral. It removes the policy from the realm of political choice.
And elevates it into the realm of scientific necessity. It's a way of offloading accountability onto the data itself.
Precisely. It's no longer we chose to do this, it's we had no choice.
Okay, so that's the first one. The second objective seems much more direct, more confrontational, to attack opponents.
Oh, absolutely. In the political arena, scientific findings become invaluable ammunition. If a rival party or an opposing candidate is closely tied to a certain industry or policy,
you find, or maybe you commission, some science that contradicts their position.
It's a strategic masterstroke. And the details of the study, its limitations, its methodology, all of that becomes irrelevant.
All that matters is the headline, the conclusion that you can use to undermine the opposition.
Right. You see this constantly in regulatory debates. One side will selectively publish or promote research suggesting an opponent's favorite product is hazardous, completely ignoring the larger scientific context.
The third objective you mention is, it's a fascinating one because it feels very current. It's to claim moral superiority.
This is so crucial today. We're in an age where political decisions are increasingly framed in moral terms, aren't they?
Definitely.
So using science to define your policy as ethically mandated, whether you frame it as being environmentally necessary or socially just or economically responsible, it's an incredibly powerful tool for claiming the high ground.
So a politician can stand up and say, our side follows the science, therefore our policies are objectively moral.
And what that does is it fundamentally dismisses the opposition. They're not just politically different anymore. They're now framed as irrational or even unethical.
And that brings us to the fourth objective, which seems to be about the raw mechanics of power, to bolster authority. How does a scientific finding actually lend legitimacy to an administration?
It's all about borrowing credibility. Political leaders know that citizens, for the most part, place a certain level of trust in the rigor and impartiality of scientific institutions.
So they co-opt that trust.
Systematically, they'll establish advisory bodies but pack them with political allies. They might create a new science czar position. Or they'll commission these high-profile reports that are specifically designed from the outset to deliver a favorable conclusion.
So they're essentially manufacturing a scientific consensus that just happens to support their existing power structure.
And to the public, it looks like objective truth. It lends this veneer of legitimacy to what are often purely ideologically driven actions.
So if science is now being deployed to justify, to attack, to claim superiority, and to bolster power, what does that do to the research community itself? This is where we get to the risk of ideological capture.
And this is where the pressure on sincere, honest researchers becomes immense. When these external political or social forces push so aggressively on specific fields.
We're thinking of things like public health, climate science, maybe certain historical studies.
Right. Those fields risk becoming dominated by a kind of rigid orthodoxy. The initial scientific investigation gives way to, well, an activist paradigm or a very specific political worldview.
It stops being about discovery, and as the outline puts it, it starts becoming dogma.
Which is the kiss of death for scientific progress. It truly is. Because once science becomes dogma, the pursuit of truth is fundamentally blocked.
How so?
If there's a politically or socially dominant view within an academic field, genuine dissent, even if it's methodologically sound and raises legitimate questions, it isn't debated.
It's punished.
It is often punished.
When you say punished or excluded, what does that actually look like for a working scientist? We're not just talking about a harsh email, are we?
Oh, no. It's far more severe than that. It's material, career-altering consequences. It can mean being denied access to crucial federal grant money, which effectively kills your research.
So your work just stops.
It stops dead. It also involves aggressive gatekeeping by academic journals, where any submission that challenges the dominant narrative is just reflexively rejected, without even a serious review.
And in the university setting?
It can mean being denied tenure or promotion. For government scientists, it can mean forced reassignment to an irrelevant project, having their research reports edited by political appointees, or just being fired outright.
These are real mechanisms of exclusion, then. They enforce conformity.
They do. And it means that researchers who simply ask difficult, complex questions, which is the entire function of science, they risk professional ruin for doing their job.
And that, in turn, makes it incredibly difficult for you, the listener, to figure out what is genuine scientific exploration and what is just the institutional enforcement of a politically convenient narrative.
It breeds public distrust because the system starts to look like it's speaking with a single, unchallengeable voice that just so happens to align perfectly with whoever's in power.
Okay, let's move into the tactics, the actual mechanics of this distortion. How exactly do political actors take a complex, nuanced scientific finding, package it, and then turn it into a political sledgehammer? It seems to start with manipulating the very idea of scientific consensus.
The politicization of scientific consensus is, I would argue, the most effective rhetorical technique in the modern playbook. And the core concept here is what we can call selective acceptance.
Selective acceptance, meaning?
Meaning a political party or an administration will very happily and very loudly cite the scientific consensus on any issue that aligns with their agenda. For instance, supporting national investment in quantum computing or promoting mandatory disease surveillance.
They leverage that scientific authority to reinforce what they already wanted to do.
Exactly. But the moment that very same concept of consensus addresses an inconvenient truth,
like the public health risks from a politically connected industry's pollution,
or the need for costly climate mitigation efforts,
then suddenly that consensus is denied or dismissed.
instantly. It's a transparent tool of convenience. It reveals that the goal isn't to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The goal is to use the authority of science as a rhetorical weapon, but only when it's convenient.
The evidence isn't a compass, it's just a talking point.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And this brings us back to something you mentioned earlier, the weaponization of uncertainty. Science is rarely 100% certain.
Almost never.
And when that consensus contradicts a powerful interest, that normal, healthy uncertainty gets inflated into this huge deal.
That gap, that remaining 5 or 10% of uncertainty, that's where political actors spend millions of dollars to create what is essentially regulatory paralysis.
They start demanding more research.
Right. More rigorous studies, we need more statistical significance. These findings haven't been replicated enough. On the surface, these sound like very responsible, cautious requests, don't they?
They sound like due diligence.
But in practice, it's a pure strategy to stall action indefinitely. It's about shifting the goalposts constantly to ensure the status quo, which just happens to benefit the politically connected foot, is maintained for years or even decades while these pointless studies just pile up.
So if they can't stall it, they try to confuse it. They manufacture a division using what's called false equivalence.
Yes. If a powerful interest is threatened by, say, a 97% consensus on an issue, they know they don't need to prove the 97% is wrong.
They just need to make the dissenting 3% fringe seem equally valid.
And that amplification is managed through very calculated public relations and media strategy. They'll often fund their own think tanks or small research groups whose entire purpose is to produce reports that counter the dominant view, often without any rigorous peer review.
And then those fringe voices are given a huge platform.
Disproportionate airtime on politically aligned media outlets. They're framed as legitimate alternatives or counter-experts. So the public hears two voices and naturally assumes there must be a genuine 50-50 split among experts.
Which leads them to conclude that policymakers are right to do nothing until this division is resolved.
A division that was manufactured from the start. The goal is consistency with political expedience, not with scientific truth.
Moving on from consensus manipulation, there's this other tactic, using scientific language as a literal shield for ideological or economic motives. The sources call this moral laundering.
Moral laundering is a powerful concept. It's the strategy of using these inherently positive-sounding but vague scientific terms, like data-driven, evidence-based, or scientifically supported, to describe policies that are fundamentally rooted in something else entirely.
Like budgetary concerns or pure ideology.
Exactly. It's a rebranding exercise. A policy that might really be about cutting corporate taxes or rolling back environmental protections gets reframed as what the objective science demands. It provides ethical cover for what are, at their core, self-serving political choices.
And this isn't just a modern PR trick. This tactic has some deep, dark historical roots. The source material points to the early 20th century pseudoscience of eugenics as the ultimate warning.
That example is absolutely essential because it shows the immense danger of science being co-opted for moral justification. Eugenics wasn't just a few individuals with prejudices. It was a massive government-backed movement.
Right.
It used distorted statistical models and completely false biological claims to cloak deep-seated racism and classism in the language of scientific legitimacy. And this gave governments the moral authority to enact these huge state programs.
And what were the concrete actions that governments justified using that pseudoscience?
They justified horrific, irreversible policies. We're talking about the forced sterilization of hundreds of thousands of people who were deemed unfit or feeble-minded.
Things that are unimaginable today.
It led to the institutionalization of segregation policies and the creation of highly restrictive immigration laws that targeted specific ethnic groups, all based on these fabricated claims of biological inferiority. The science provided the cold, objective rationale for actions that were rooted purely in political and racial control.
It's a terrifying example.
It really is. It demonstrates that once science becomes a moral justification for restricting human rights, rather than just a guide for understanding the world, its destructive potential is. It's limitless.
Which brings us to a less visible but maybe equally decisive lever of control. The funding mechanism. Political actors get to decide not only what research sees the light of day,
but also what research never even begins.
And this is the idea of agenda-driven funding priorities.
Exactly. Governments funnel enormous amounts of money into scientific fields that directly align with their national interests. Things like defense technology, high-yield agriculture, advanced energy systems that support the incumbent industries.
while at the same time they underfund or just completely neglect the areas that might challenge those established structures.
And that underfunding is a form of what's called soft censorship.
How does that work? How do you kill a field of research without ever explicitly banning it?
You do it through the budget. You quietly reduce the funding lines, or you simply fail to renew grant programs. So instead of passing a law that says you can't research climate change, a government might just zero out the operational budget for the key atmospheric monitoring stations.
Or they'll just quietly retire an entire research department within a federal agency.
It's a slow bureaucratic death. The research just withers on the vine because the infrastructure, the personnel, the long-term funding, it's all withdrawn. You've suppressed the field without ever having to publicly admit you're in a fight with it. It's strategic stagnation.
And we've seen very specific examples of this kind of suppression, especially with politically inconvenient findings like climate reports. What are the common methods used to sanitize or bury those results after the research is already done?
Once a report is finished and it's ready for publication, the political process kicks in with strategic editing. This can involve removing specific high-risk words.
For example, changing a phrase like rapidly accelerating crisis to something like potential long-term challenge.
Precisely. Or it involves blocking the release of the report entirely, maybe delaying it until after a major election or a key policy vote. Government scientists are sometimes forced to submit every interview request, every public presentation, every paper for political review.
Which results in their findings being blocked or distorted under the guise of what? National security?
A national security review or interagency coordination. There's always a bureaucratic justification.
Now, on the flip side of this, we also have funding used for national prestige. Things like space exploration or particle physics. They're often framed as these pure scientific endeavors, but they carry enormous political weight.
Absolutely. These high-profile, high-cost scientific projects are often pursued primarily for national visibility and soft power.
Sure.
You just had to think of the space race during the Cold War. The scientific discoveries were incredible. They were monumental. But the primary political motivation was to demonstrate technological superiority and ideological resilience on the global stage. So funding, in this context, becomes the first battlefield where scientific endeavor is bent to political will.
And used as a marketing tool for a nation's capabilities.
That's it.
Beyond funding, the entire regulatory environment itself can be wielded as a political weapon. We think of regulation as something that protects the public, but it often ends up protecting established power structures.
That's the core paradox, isn't it? We see overregulation used as a weapon to specifically target competitors or threats to politically connected industries.
How would that work in practice?
Well, a government might impose these incredibly excessive, complex, and time-consuming regulatory barriers like requiring years of costly and redundant environmental impact studies on new technologies. Say, advanced geothermal or specific type of renewable energy that threatens the existing fossil fuel market.
So the bureaucracy itself becomes the weapon. You bleed the newcomers dry.
You bleed them dry and you stall their adoption. And then you have the complete opposite, under-regulation for economic benefit.
Right. Fast-tracking new drugs, new chemicals, or controversial technologies, it's always framed as being innovation-friendly or a boost for the economy.
That framing is so powerful. But often, this fast-tracking happens even when there are genuine, unresolved scientific concerns about long-term safety or environmental impact,
The goal is just rapid deployment and immediate economic return.
which effectively transfers the risk and the potential long-term liability from the industry onto the public and onto future generations.
We also have to touch on the most extreme tactic, which is actual legal warfare against inconvenient findings. You describe this as the use of SLAPP suits.
Yes, strategic lawsuits against public participation. That's the classic mechanism. This is where a powerful, well-funded political or corporate interest will file a massive, complicated lawsuit against a scientist or a journal or an institution that publishes damaging research.
And the goal isn't necessarily to win the lawsuit.
Rarely. The intent is purely punitive. It's to drain the scientists' financial resources, to consume all of their time, and, maybe most importantly, to generate a chilling effect that makes other researchers terrified of publishing anything similar.
It turns the research process itself into a high-risk legal liability.
It does, and the key takeaway here is a tough one. Regulation, legal systems, and funding mechanisms. They exist to protect power, just as much as they exist to protect the public.
So when these scientific findings are distorted and weaponized, the impact moves beyond just policy documents. It seeps into the actual fabric of society. It can turn science into a tool for systemic social control.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful mechanisms for this, both historically and today, is the medicalization of deviance.
What do you mean by that?
This is when behaviors that were previously seen as, say, social problems or moral failings or even political dissent, things like addiction or certain sexual orientations or even just nonconformist political views, are reframed as medical or biological disorders.
That reframing seems subtle, but the consequences, it's profound, isn't it? It's a shift in control.
It shifts control entirely. If a problem is defined as medical, it's no longer subject to social debate or political negotiation. It falls under the control of institutional systems.
Hospitals, correctional facilities, state-sanctioned medical authorities.
Exactly. The solution becomes treatment or a cure rather than social reform or political dialogue. And that gives the state enormous leverage to define and enforce social norms all through the authority of medicine.
And this institutional control is often backed up by surveillance. Governments are constantly justifying expanded policing and monitoring by using the language of safety science.
We see this clearly with the rollout of things like predictive policing algorithms and mass government surveillance systems. These systems rely on findings from behavioral psychology, from crime statistics, often from very problematic social science research.
But because they're data-driven and presented as objective,
They're given tremendous credibility, even when the underlying data is clearly biased or the methodology is scientifically weak. Science provides the technical, objective justification for a deeper, more pervasive government reach into our lives.
and we saw this play out so dramatically during recent global events. Public health crises, like pandemics, they immediately become political battlegrounds where scientific recommendations get weaponized.
They provide political actors with maximum leverage. A scientific consensus around, say, mandates or movement restrictions or vaccinations is used either to dramatically expand executive authority
Framing these new powers as necessary for long-term preparedness.
or, on the flip side, that same consensus is used by opposition movements to organize ideological resistance against what they frame as scientific overreach or authoritarianism.
So in a crisis, science becomes the language that political actors use to demand obedience or to organize a rebellion.
It becomes the central battlefield.
And the battleground isn't just over the findings or the funding, it's over the words themselves, the politicization of scientific language.
Language manipulation is so critical because it manages public perception before the facts even land. We already mentioned the intentional shift from the urgent phrase global warming to the much milder climate change. That was done to soften the emotional and policy urgency.
And it goes deeper into these framing effects. I'm thinking of the manipulation of terms that sound so positive, like evidence-based policy or scientific literacy.
Those phrases are absolutely deployed as rhetorical weapons. Evidence-based policy can be used to shut down democratic debate. It implies that only the chosen experts have a right to speak on an issue.
What about terms like alternative studies or sound science?
Those are often jargon used by industry-funded groups. They're used to imply that only the research that supports the industry position is rigorous, while all the contradictory independent research can be dismissed as poor science or just activism. If you control the language, you control the frame of the debate.
And then you have what we could call definitional warfare. This is where the political system tries to lock down the definition of a scientific concept before the scientific community has even reached a consensus.
This is a really high-leverage tactic, especially in complex fields. Think about the political debate over defining what counts as renewable energy.
Right.
If a powerful political bloc is tied to, say, the natural gas or nuclear industries, they might push legislation to define renewable in a way that includes their favorite technology.
Which would unlock huge tax credits and subsidies, even if the scientific community doesn't really consider it renewable.
Exactly. We see this with terms like harm reduction, where political interests clash over a definition that might allow for strategies that run counter to their preferred abstinence-only approaches. By controlling the definition, you predetermine the entire universe of what policies are even permissible.
So if the political system can control the definition of viable or safe or renewable in the public square, they inherently control the narrative and the policy conversation that follows. We've laid out this entire array of tactics used to distort scientific narratives, and the synthesis of all this manipulation, it seems, is the public's eroding faith. Why are so many analytical people like our listeners, losing trust in scientific institutions?
I think it's a crisis of manufactured inconsistency.
Yeah.
When the public is constantly bombarded with conflicting expert opinions, especially when those opinions seem to shift abruptly right after an election or a major policy debate,
When they see high-profile retractions or just visibly agenda-driven messaging.
the whole system loses its credibility. The public correctly perceives that scientific conclusions are often being forced to fit into neat political containers. When you see experts consistently twisting their conclusions to fit an agenda, you stop trusting the science and you stop trusting the government.
And that is a catastrophic combination for a society.
It is.
And this feeds directly into what's known as the polarization effect. Once a scientific topic masks climate change, a public health measure becomes linked to a political identity.
The evidence stops being the primary factor.
The citizens starts choosing their position based on maintaining their affiliation with their social tribe.
The question they're asking themselves is, what does my tribe believe? What position validates my social identity? The scientific evidence becomes completely secondary to that tribal loyalty.
And that's why you can see highly educated people rejecting rigorous science in one field that's politically charged, while at the same time they completely trust complex science in a non-charged field, like engineering or astrophysics.
The political charge is what dictates the level of skepticism.
But, and this is a really crucial nuance, we can't just label all of this skepticism as ignorance or some kind of anti-science mindset. Some of it is an entirely rational response to everything we've just detailed.
That is the critical distinction we have to make. Much of the rising public skepticism isn't directed against the process of science itself. It's not against the telescope or the test tube.
It's directed against the authority that's wielding that science.
Exactly. It's an intuitive and I would say understandable response to the feeling that science has become too entangled with, too compliant with, and too funded by political and corporate machinery.
So when people sense that every claim now seems to carry what the sources call the fingerprints of power, their skepticism isn't a rejection of knowledge. It's a rational defense mechanism against deliberate manipulation.
They are reacting against the distortion. They're reacting against the obvious political orchestration, not against knowledge itself. When the public sees a government-funded study that reaches a conclusion that just so happens to perfectly benefit a politically connected industry.
Or when the official data changes immediately after a change in administration.
The public correctly registers that as a political shift, not a scientific paradigm shift. The responsibility for this crisis of trust lies squarely with the political actors and the institutions that abuse scientific authority.
And the long-term consequences of this go far beyond just trust issues, don't they? What's the systemic cost of building policy on manipulated science?
Well, the first cost is the stagnation of true innovation. When science is suppressed or manipulated, or when academic incentives are warped to only favor politically convenient research, progress just slows down.
Brilliant researchers are discouraged, they get misdirected, or they just leave the field entirely.
We end up wasting billions on research that's designed to deliver a specific predetermined outcome instead of funding the risky, transformative basic research that leads to real breakthroughs.
And then there's the final, severe cost of policies built on faulty science.
This is the immense long-term societal harm. Policies that are built on intentional scientific distortion or on historical pseudoscience, whether in public health, energy, or economic regulation, they can embed themselves so deeply into our laws and institutions.
That they can take decades, sometimes generations, to identify and reverse.
Right. They misallocate resources for years, they create massive institutional inertia, and they often end up disproportionately harming the most vulnerable populations for decades to come.
We've explored the political systems and the structures that bend scientific narratives to their will, using findings as ammunition and experts as shields. But if politics can redefine truth and distort reality so profoundly, what happens to the individuals who are caught in the middle? The dedicated researchers who face pressure not just to uncover the truth, but to survive telling it in a political landscape that's determined to filter or censor or weaponize their work. That feels like the personal cost and the next line of inquiry that this investigation really opens up.
I think we have to recognize that science doesn't exist in a vacuum above politics. It's pulled into it, it's shaped by it, and often it's overwhelmed by it. Understanding these mechanics, how facts become ammunition, how consensus is selectively deployed, how funding and regulation are wielded, that's the foundation. It's the first step toward resisting that manipulation and reclaiming critical thinking amidst this storm of competing narratives.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.